My name is Pat Ruckert, and we're going to discuss tonight, the title I put on it is General Sherman's March to the Sea, the Principle of the Flank, and the New Great March by the BRICS. A week ago, in discussions with his associates, LaRouche said the following. He said, "The United States is not simply a collection of local states. The United States is the name of a union which is indivisible, despite what happened in the period of the Civil War. And it means that the local states are not independent states as such. They are subjects of the United States. Their subject elements are integral to the United States as a whole. The idea that a particular state has its own independent right in terms of the United States is a delusion and implicit treason. There's only one United States. There are no separate states. That was a Confederate idea. We don't like the Confederacy. Now, the preamble of the United States Constitution makes that just emphatically clear. It reads, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." In other words, it is the people of this nation that created the Constitution, not the states. They did it to form a more perfect union. They did it not for today's pleasures, but for the general welfare of all the people of the nation. And they did it not just for themselves, but also for posterity, for the generations not yet born. For the past 40 years, Lyndon LaRouche has campaigned with unrelenting determination for the creation of a new global system based upon the ideas expressed in the Constitution as exemplified in the economic policies of Alexander Hamilton, the American system. LaRouche's campaign, emerging over 40 years ago, was totally unexpected in terms of this financial oligarchy's expectations of some potential opposition to their globalized slavery. And similarly, our recently created Manhattan Project to evoke out of New York City a new movement that will give direction once again to this nation to in fact embrace and very concretely ensure that the United States joins with the BRICS. A flank, to put it simply, in politics, in economics, or war, is a creative action that is unexpected by your opponent. It's an action they did not think was possible. They did not think that you would carry out. An action, perhaps, that nobody had ever thought of before. An action that catches the enemy off guard and defeats him. And that's what was required 150 years ago, when the United States was in a great civil war, which, as President Abraham Lincoln said at Gettysburg, it was testing whether this nation can long endure. And as we shall see, it was doing what the Confederate leaders did not expect that in the end brought them to defeat and demonstrated that, yes, the nation can endure. From November 16th to December 22nd, 1864, exactly 150 years ago, right now, one of the most outstanding flanks in all of human warfare was carried out by General William Tecumseh Sherman as he devastated the Confederacy with his march to the sea. His 300-mile march was 62,000 soldiers right through the heart of Georgia, from Atlanta to Savannah. And in the process, he violated every rule and principle that was accepted as how to act in war. And as he did this, Sherman and his partner, General Ulysses S. Grant, were the generals Lincoln had been looking for since the beginning of the Civil War in 1861. He had been frustrated as the Union Army was defeated again and again by the Confederates, or was stalemated, because the Union generals were either incompetent, unimaginative, or merely career-minded. You know, what do I get out of this? You know, and these two generals, Sherman and Grant, lived the idea of our republic. They had no other agenda but to ensure it would be victorious and ensure that it would survive the greatest challenge to its unity ever in its history. To celebrate the idea that the United States is one unified nation, as LaRouche stated, tonight we'll join General Sherman in his march to the sea as we work to ensure the successful march of the BRICS. But first, a couple more lines or moments about the idea of the flank, because it's a word or phrase that is used quite often and usually by people who do not know what they're talking about. LaRouche has discussed the idea of the flank many, many times over the decades, always stressing that it is the power of the creative mind that looks for and finds that which had never before existed. In science or economics, it is the new idea that overthrows all presently accepted doctrines. In warfare, it is simply the action of ripping up all the war manuals from the last war and daring to do all that was forbidden to commanders to do. Too risky. You know, it's never been done before. You know, whatever other excuse. And so we'll have a few pictures here tonight. We'll start with President Abraham Lincoln. Throughout the 1850s, as the United States seemed to stumble toward a civil war, what would become the Civil War, our most creative president ever, Abraham Lincoln, positioned himself and prepared himself for the challenge to preserve the Union in the crisis that was developing. A crucial step Lincoln took in seeking the presidency was his speech early in 1860 at Cooper Union Hall in New York City, which put him on the map, so to speak, made him a contending major candidate for the Republican nomination for president in 1860. And of course, demonstrating once again the central role of New York City in giving direction to the entire nation. Lincoln was elected in November 1860. Yet a month before he took office, on March 4th, 1861, the Confederacy was created, led by South Carolina. All the nations of the South had seceded from the Union and claimed to be what they hoped was a new independent country called the Confederacy. And then, despite all Lincoln's attempts to avoid war, the British-supported Confederacy initiated it on April 12, 1861, by firing its cannons on the federal fort at Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, which had led the Union, or led the states out of the Union. But since our focus tonight is not the Civil War per se, but something a little more narrow, despite all the interesting material that we won't cover, I think first what we'll do is we'll get to know our protagonists. General William Tecumseh Sherman and his partner, General Ulysses S. Grant. At the time of the outbreak of the U.S. Civil War, were probably the two most unlikely personages who would emerge to lead the Union battle. Sherman, born in Ohio in 1820, was one of 11 children of a state Supreme Court judge. But Sherman had to leave his family at the age of 9 when his father died, leaving his mother virtually penniless. And his very appropriate middle name, Tecumseh, was the name of an Indian chief, known for his intelligence and his cunning, and sometimes described as a great warrior. So Sherman grew up in the family of John Ewing, another Ohio Whig, as his father was, like Lincoln. Ewing was not only a prominent politician in Ohio, but soon to become a U.S. Senator, and then in the, which administration was it? I can't remember. But anyway, he served as the Interior Secretary. I think it was in the Hayes, not the Hayes administration, I forget. Anyway, so the Sherman was sent to West Point and he graduated in 1840. And during the next few years he was stationed at various army posts around the country, including in Georgia and South Carolina, which later in his march to the sea, this of course would be of invaluable experience. And Sherman had one habit throughout his entire life that also was helpful. Whenever he went from his home to somewhere else, he would always return by a different road in order to learn the geography. And he did it everywhere, all the time, his entire life. Right? Now, during the U.S. war with Mexico in 1850, he was stationed in California, and therefore he was not in the U.S.-Mexican War. And in 1849, President Tyler, that's who, Ewing was Secretary of Interior for Tyler, read to the nation about the discovery of gold verbatim from a report from Army Colonel or Sergeant, whatever he was at the time, Sherman. He also helped to survey the city of Sacramento, and in 1856 was the Major General of the California militia that put down the vigilantes. Sherman also laid out the route of the California section of the Transcontinental Railroad in the early 1850s, almost a decade before Lincoln put it before the Congress and it was voted for. You know, so, and then later, when the Transcontinental Railroad was actually built in the middle of the 1860s and completed 1869, the route that Sherman had laid out from Sacramento to the Sierras was exactly the route Sherman had mapped a decade or more before. And then, where'd it go? So he was based in San Francisco most of this time, and at one point, some of the representatives of the Democratic Party asked him to run for city as a candidate for city treasurer, and Sherman said no. And he added, quote, "I am not eligible because I have not graduated from the penitentiary." Okay. So, but seeing no future for himself and his family in the Army, he resigned from the Army in 1853 while he was in California, and he went into banking. And remember, his foster father is a U.S. Senator, and so Sherman had all kinds of, very high-level political connections, so going into banking was fairly easy to do, but the entire banking system crashed in 1857, and that ended that career. So 2 careers down. He next became, he actually went into real estate. That didn't work out. And then finally, he became superintendent of a new military academy in Louisiana. A military academy, like West Point. No, this is just began. 20 students. All the sons of planters, and a bunch of real assholes, you have to deal with, So he was not even in the Army when the South seceded. And he generally considered himself a failure in life. Right? The vote for secession, though, as it began in December of 1860 with South Carolina, and then in January with the rest of the southern states, that was a move he knew would destroy the nation, and he would not tolerate it. In a letter to a Southern friend, he wrote, "You people of the South don't know what you're doing. This country will be drenched in blood, and God only knows how it will end. War is a terrible thing. You mistake, too, the people of the North. They are a peaceful people, but an earnest people, and they will fight, too. They're not going to let this country be destroyed without a mighty effort to save it. Besides, where are your men and appliances of war to contend against them? The North can make a steam engine, locomotive, or railway car. Hardly a yard of cloth or a pair of shoes can you make." So the Civil War began when General Beauregard, the Confederate Army, began bombarding Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. But during secession, Sherman resigned from his position as superintendent of this military academy. The military academy exists today, same one, but it's now known as Louisiana State University. So, but anyway, so he went to Washington, D.C. He was introduced directly to Abraham Lincoln by his foster father, Senator John Ewing. He was appointed to command troops and saw his first action at Manassas, or Bull Run. Then transferred to the West, he came in immediate conflict with Secretary of War Simon Cameron, who was in the area of Memphis or somewhere like that, and he met with Sherman. Now, Sherman told him that for Tennessee and Kentucky alone, the Union would need 200,000 troops. Right? Now, this is at a point, literally in the first couple months, where almost every politician in the country was saying the war will be over in 3 months. That's why Lincoln called for volunteers who would volunteer for 90 days. That's what virtually everybody in the country, and especially the top political leaders, thought. Right? Now, Cameron was a very corrupt and a very dirty guy. And he said to Sherman, when Sherman said we'll need 200,000 troops right here, he said to Sherman, "You're crazy, you're insane." And then he put the story in the newspapers. And newspapers all over the country were saying Sherman's insane. Right? So Sherman almost left the army at that point. But Cameron was soon fired by Lincoln for both incompetence and corruption. And Sherman's prediction that there would be the necessity of 200,000 troops in Tennessee and Kentucky, of course, was more than accurate. Like his earlier warnings to his Southern friends that if they started a war, they would be destroyed. And how at the end of the Civil War, he forecast the disaster that Reconstruction actually became. All this led some historians to call him a prophet. And like Lloyd Lewis, who titled his biography of Sherman, Sherman, Fighting Prophet. Now, Sherman did not leave the army. Instead, he linked up with another failure in life. Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Grant was born in Ohio in 1822, 2 years after Sherman. Named for the great Greek warrior, which Homer in the Odyssey actually spells that way, but Ulysses is the same figure in Greek mythology, right? The great warrior. He then attends West Point, graduates in 1843. He served with the army in Mexico, and after the war in 1847, he was shipped to the Pacific Northwest, up into the Oregon Territory, and then down to California. So he's in California at the same time Sherman is, but they really do not, get to know each other if they even met at all. Right? But he felt stuck, He's also accused of being drunkard, which later in the Civil War, when some were trying to denigrate Grant after the Battle of Vicksburg, and they accused Grant of being a drunk, Lincoln said, "Well, what's he drink? I'm sending him a whole case." So he goes back to Ohio after resigning from the army, and he failed in real estate, just like Sherman. He failed at farming. And when the Civil War actually broke out, he was a lowly clerk in his father's dry goods store in Galena, Illinois. Right? recruited by the governor of Illinois to organize the volunteers for the war. Because of his West Point background, Grant rapidly rose through the ranks, and by late 1862, was a general in charge of the entire Western theater of the war. Both of these men had no ambition to be the great general in this war. Reluctantly, especially Sherman, accepting promotions and advancement, which was based solely on their determination and competence. Grant first demonstrated this quality when he led the Union forces to capture the Confederate forts Henry and Donelson in early February 1862. These are on the Tennessee and the Cumberland River. And he captured these two forts in less than 1 week. Two of them, right? At Fort Donelson, the Confederates were forced to accept Grant's demand of unconditional surrender, or face the annihilation of 12,000 Confederate troops who became Grant's prisoners. Right? This was the first outstanding Union victory in the Civil War, and it made Grant's name a household word. And the press picked this up, and they noted that Grant's first two initials, U.S., were also the first letters of unconditional surrender. Therefore, Grant became known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. Right? But it was Shiloh in April 1862 where both demonstrated the qualities of leadership for which President Lincoln had been searching. The Union Army under Grant was preparing to attack the Confederate forces under General Albert Sidney Johnson at Corinth, Mississippi. This is early April 1862. Grant was gathering his forces together 20 miles north near Pittsburgh Landing and Shiloh Church on the Tennessee River. But on the morning of April 6, Johnson, who actually was a competent general, even though a Confederate, surprised the Union forces by attacking. And Sherman didn't expect it. And here we have that's Sherman, here's Grant, and this is Shiloh. First map. So Johnson's troops hit the Union forces about, right at daybreak when they're just getting up, and drove them back, and though thousands of Grant's troops panicked and fled, with as many as 5,000 of them, running to the Tennessee River, and they couldn't swim across. Some of them tried and drowned. And most of them just hid, under the banks, right near the river, trembling, for the whole rest of the day. But that was 5,000 out of 60,000 or something like that, And Grant and Sherman rallied the majority of the Union forces, but were slowly pushed back by the Confederates, as you can see, back towards where the name Grant is. Pittsburgh Landing is right there. Right? And this is where the riverboats would come down, or rather, the river flows north at this point. Would come up the river delivering supplies. Right? Another army, Union Army, headed up by General Buell, was coming on foot from this direction. They should have been there by the 6th, but they were not. Right? And Thus, Grant was short about 20,000 troops that he had planned on when he was attacked. Right? So, in the late afternoon, though, General Albert Sidney Johnston was killed. Right? And he was replaced by General Beauregard, the same one who fired the first shots at Charleston on Fort Sumner. And Beauregard, confident of victory, said, let's take a break for the rest of the day. Right? And he called off the attack. Right? And said, tomorrow morning we'll drive Grant's army into the river. Right? Well, fatal mistake. Now here you see map 2. Union forces have been driven back almost to where the name Grant is now by about 6 p.m. And that's when Beauregard called off the attack for the day. But it's a fatal mistake in warfare to actually, when you're winning, to stop and take a break. You know? So Grant and Sherman, all through the night, positioned their forces. And Buell actually arrived. And he was ferried over, another 20,000 troops added to Grant's forces. And Beauregard, did nothing during the night, did not prepare, didn't rearm, did nothing. And his troops, just ate their fill at the more plentiful camps of the Union Army. And Beauregard said, we'll attack in the morning, drive into the river. Well, before Beauregard could attack, even before daylight, Grant, Sherman, Buell all attacked. Right? And so map 3 gives you a little sense of it. The counterattack on the morning of April 7th. Right? Sherman was at the center of the Union counterattack, even though the day before, the first day of the battle, he had been wounded twice and had 3 horses shot out from under him. The Battle of Shiloh, with more than 20,000 dead and wounded, shocked the nation into finally realizing this was going to be a long and a bloody war. So, General Halleck, who was kind of the national security coordinator for Lincoln, was in the region, in the area, actually overseeing the armies, right? And he said this in his after-battle report. It is the unanimous opinion here that Brigadier General W.T. Sherman saved the fortune of the day on the 6th and contributed largely to the glorious victory on the 7th. He was in the thickest of the fight on both days. I respectfully request that he be made a major general. Okay? So, by the spring of 1863, with Union armies, outside of what Grant and Sherman was doing, suffered devastating defeats, mostly in Virginia. Grant and Sherman, though, demonstrated for the first time how a powerful creative flank could turn the war. And this was the battle and siege of Vicksburg. Grant's forces began to campaign to take Vicksburg in late 1862. Vicksburg was not only a most important city in the West, but it sat high above the Mississippi River, and it controlled it. In order to make the Mississippi a major artery for Union transportation of troops and supplies, Vicksburg had to be captured by the Union Army. It had to be taken. But it was virtually surrounded on two sides by impassable swamps, and a third side by the cliffs overlooking the river. The only way in was directly from the west. And that area was just full of Confederate troops. So what were they to do? So here's a map of Vicksburg, and you can see, this is Vicksburg, this is the Mississippi coming down, and Vicksburg cannons are aimed right into the river. So any Union boats trying to get through had very little chance of actually getting through. Right? And you had the swamps and the bayous up here and down here. But way down here in Bruinsburg, then the land becomes dry. Right? So at a certain point in the spring of 1862, Grant says, to hell with it. We're going to run the gauntlet of the guns. Right? And he packed up the boats with bales of hay in order to try to deflect the cannon fire, the shot from the cannon fire, and he ran the boats with all the supplies down the river. The troops marched overland down to here, Bruinsburg. And then they crossed here to Port, and then marched to Port Gibson, and then marched toward the capital of Mississippi, Jackson, right over here, right? And fighting one battle after another with the Confederates, and winning them all. Right? But to do so, Grant had to abandon his own supply line. And for the first time, the Union Army raided and lived off the land. The farms and the cities and the towns they went through, they would take what they needed for the supplies of the Union. So this, after one capturing Jackson, the Mississippi capital, then Grant's entire forces moved on Vicksburg, and a siege of the city began on May 18th, and the city surrendered on a very appropriate day, July 4th. Right? Which was actually one day after the Union victory at Gettysburg, July 3rd. With those two victories, the war had turned. And it was assumed then by virtually everyone, especially the Europeans and especially the British, who had been contemplating entering the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. But these two victories said the Union's going to win the war. But how much time would it take was the crucial question. The hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded Union Army troops suffered by the North was rapidly exhausting the North's population of tolerance, their patience. 51,000 casualties at Gettysburg alone. And you got to think about that. The entire Vietnam War in over 10 years was 56,000 dead. Gettysburg alone had 51,000 dead and wounded. So the population said, when is this going to end? We cannot take this too much longer. Right? So by the spring of 1864, Lincoln had called Grant east, put him in command of all the armies of the Union, and promoting him to Lieutenant General, a rank only previously held by George Washington. The But I want to give you a little sense on the Vicksburg battle or siege, right? Before they actually began the siege, as I mentioned, they had been battling for a couple of weeks or more, one Confederate force after another and defeating them, right? So before the siege began, this biography of Sherman states the following: in the 20 days that had passed since they crossed the Mississippi, they had claimed 250 miles of the river, fought and won 5 separate battles, not to speak of endless skirmishes, captured the state capital, marched 180 miles, made 6,000 enemies throw down their muskets and surrender, killed and wounded as many more, seized 27 heavy guns, 61 lighter pieces, and they fed themselves. Right? That's what an army can do when it has leadership. So Grant is now based in Washington, D.C., but he refused to stay there. He said, I'm going to be in the field with the troops, so he's in Virginia. So in the spring of 1864, with Grant's unstoppable or unrelenting attack on General Lee's armies, which the Union Army on the East Coast had never done. Right? And Sherman beginning his march to Atlanta from Tennessee, the outcome of the war and the existence of the nation rested on these 2 leaders. By the end of April, Grant was locked in a deadly pounding war with Lee, and which would essentially only end in June, with Grant on the outskirts of Petersburg, just south of Richmond, the Confederate capital, and a 10-month siege began. Now, while Grant held Lee in Richmond and Petersburg, Sherman was essentially assigned to destroy the Confederate armies in the West and destroy the ability to feed and supply Lee's army from the rest of the Confederacy. The campaign was described as a hammer and an anvil, one pounding and one being the anvil that the subject would be pounded upon. So by this time, Sherman was thinking a little differently than he had when the war began. Because he has a lot of Southern friends, lots of them, right? And he was not an abolitionist. He thought slavery was stupid, but he was not going to fight to abolish slavery. He was fighting to save the Union, right? So that's how he began. But by the spring of 1864, he thought of himself as the destroyer of illegality and rebelliousness, the scourge of the lawless, the punitive force, the performer of work that someone must do before the gentle tasks of healing could begin. Right? That's how Sherman began looking at himself. Right? Now, he began his Atlanta campaign, and in his invasion of the state of Georgia, he demonstrated one of the most remarkable movements of a large army against a not quite so large, but very competently led opponent. You know, the most remarkable campaign in military history up till that point, and probably still today. Facing the Confederate forces of General Joseph Johnston, which interestingly, it was Johnston who surrendered to Sherman in April 1865 after Lee had surrendered to Grant. Right? So, but Johnson was a very competent general. Right? For nearly 3 months, as Sherman marched his troops from Tennessee down to Atlanta, a couple hundred miles, right? He would approach Johnson's lines and then go around the flank. Right? And Johnson would have to fall back 20 miles and set up a new blockade of Sherman. And Sherman would approach the next line and go around the other way. Right? And Johnson have to fall back again. Only one time did they actually have a head-on collision, and Sherman, said, "I was right. Doing this doesn't work," and because he got 2,000 of his troops killed. Right? So, and Johnson would not come out and fight Sherman directly because he had a much smaller army than Sherman did. Right? So, but President Davis of the Confederacy thought Johnson should fight him. And finally he removed Johnson and he put in General John Bell Hood. And Sherman said, "This is the happiest day of the campaign," because Hood was, impulsive. And Sherman knew Hood would attack him. Right? And Sherman knew that he would defeat Hood every time he attacked. So you get a sense of, even during the war, how much respect for Sherman's flanking capability from a Southerner, a Confederate, who'd been captured by Sherman's army, and he said, "Sherman will never go to hell. He will flank the devil and make heaven in spite of the guards." So backed into, being backed into Atlanta at the end of July, Hood repeatedly made forays out to attack Sherman and just lost more and more troops. Now, so a siege of Atlanta began, with Sherman pouring artillery into the city and sending out forays of troops for miles around, ripping up and destroying all the railroads. And of course, taking all the food and fodder that his army needed. Even though Sherman was maintaining a supply line 200 miles back to Tennessee, a railroad that he had to deploy thousands of troops to guard from Confederate cavalry raids. Right? So Atlanta's completely surrounded, under siege, and Hood fled the city with his troops on September 1st, and Union forces moved in 2 days later. The fall of Atlanta was celebrated in the North like no other victory. It guaranteed Lincoln's re-election in November, because during the spring and summer, with the population tiring of the war, even many of the leading Republicans in Lincoln's party had been discussing, we need a different candidate for November. Lincoln himself thought that I will lose re-election in November, and in that case, he wrote in a note, I will work with the incoming president to try to end this war before the incoming president is inaugurated in the following March. But the fall of Atlanta guaranteed Lincoln's re-election. Now, for the next month and a half, Sherman rested his troops, sent his cavalry out again and again to destroy railroads, and they began dismantling the war machine that was Atlanta. Whoops, I forgot something here. Okay, here's Sherman's march from Tennessee. Oops, where'd it go? Yeah, from Tennessee to Atlanta, which is right down here somewhere. Atlanta, right here. Right? So he moves down, flanks, Hood sets up again. Sherman flanks, Johnson sets up again. Sherman flanks. They do it all the way down until Kennesaw Mountain, where they did have one head-on clash. Right? But it's this point that Hood replaces Johnson, and Hood backs into Atlanta. Right? And for the next nearly month and a half, there's a siege of Atlanta. So the so at this when Atlanta's captured, Grant said the following. He wrote the following. He said, in a letter to Sherman, Grant wrote, "You have accomplished the most gigantic undertaking given to any general in this war, with a skill and ability that will be acknowledged in history as unsurpassed, if not unequaled." Right? So, history is being made, every week here. History that still stands. Right? So, he had demonstrated in the Atlanta campaign that he was the master of the flank. Now Sherman designed the most daring and remarkable flank attack in all human military history, far surpassing his flanking capture of Atlanta itself. Sherman proposed to Grant and Lincoln they abandon his supply line completely and carry out a march 300 miles from Atlanta to Savannah on the coast, right, of Georgia. That he and his 62,000 troops would cut a path of destruction through Georgia 60 miles wide, living off the new harvest that had just come in and was now stored in the cities and the farms of the countryside. Both Lincoln and Grant disagreed with such a risky move, but Sherman won them over and they gave their reluctant approval. Sherman had written to Grant in describing what he wanted to do. He said, "If we can march a well-appointed army right through his territory, it is a demonstration to the world, foreign and domestic, that we have a power that President Davis cannot resist." Sherman stated that his intent was the utter destruction of the roads, houses, and people, which will cripple the military resources, and I can make Georgia howl. That's what he said. And howl it did, as did the entire Confederacy, as Sherman also destroyed Atlanta before he left it on November 16th. And in fact, today, 150 years later, those who still embrace the lost cause of the Confederacy are still howling about Sherman. Earlier, during the Atlanta occupation, Sherman had ordered all residents of the city to leave and responded to the mayor's plea to spare the citizens such a hardship. Sherman replied, You cannot qualify war in harsher terms than I. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. And those who brought war into our country deserve all the curses and maledictions a people can pour out. I know I had no hand in making the war, and I know I will make more sacrifices today than any of you to secure peace. So, here's Sherman in Atlanta. And here's the train station of Atlanta after Sherman got done with it, in the ruins. And here's some more of the ruins of Atlanta after Sherman's work of exterminating Atlanta as the transportation and manufacturing center of the entire Confederate Army. Right? So that's what he did. Now the idea behind his march to the sea was his commitment to his mission to save this republic by defeating the rebels. By the time he'd reached Atlanta, he knew that that would entail only the destruction of the Confederate population's will to continue carrying out the war. He had to destroy that will to resist. And that is the only way victory would be possible. Secondly, he knew with Grant stalemated outside Richmond at Petersburg and Lee holding him off, Sherman thought that the destruction of the region that supplied General Lee with food, manpower, and material would hasten Lee's defeat. And as Sherman planned, after he conquered Savannah, he would move through South Carolina, then North Carolina, directly threatening Lee from the south. Sherman had prepared well for his march through Georgia. He had maps drawn up. Actually, he planned this march before he even got to Atlanta, because he had maps made up. He had the 1860 census, studied and mapped out of where the population centers were, where the production of food was greatest, where the biggest herds of cattle were, right? And so he planned his march to hit those areas very specifically. Okay? And leaving Atlanta on November 16th, Sherman looked back at a city in flames because he burned the damn place as he left. Right? All the railroads were destroyed that led into it. And he knew that this is what he would do to the rest of the state of Georgia. And then he would do the same to South Carolina after he seized Savannah. In a letter he wrote at the time, he said, "If the people raise a howl against my barbarity and cruelty, I will answer that war is war and not popularity sinking. If they want peace, they and their relatives must stop the war." Of course, his march to Savannah was completely unexpected by the Confederacy. Right? And how deluded the Southern leaders and people were was demonstrated by their newspapers that reported that when Sherman and his army left Atlanta, they did so because they had been defeated and they were in retreat. Right? So, now here's a map of Sherman's march from Atlanta to Savannah. Atlanta here, Savannah here. 4 columns of troops, 60 miles wide, it wasn't quite scorched earth all the way, because, lights back on, please. Because Sherman, in his orders to his troops, to live off the land, to take from the farms and cities whatever was required for the army, to sustain the army, but he cautioned his troops not to destroy private homes. But anything that could be used by the army was to be taken. And anything that could be used by the Confederate army that was left was to be destroyed. This included thousands of tons of newly harvested food and fodder, all mines, shops, foundries, cotton mills, cotton gins, mills, all manufacturing facilities, and of course the railroads and the telegraphs. He instructed his troops not to molest the population, or do unnecessary burning of houses, unless the population allowed and supported guerrilla attacks on his line of march. Then, everything in that area was to be destroyed. There were exceptions to this rule. For example, when his troops reached the plantation of Confederate General Howell Cobb, Sherman instructed his troops to spare nothing, take everything usable, and burn all the rest to the ground. Right? And here you have what Sherman's troops did to the railroads. Right? This is the process of making what they called Sherman neckties. Right? So they rip up the railroad tracks, pile up the ties, put the rails on the fire, heat them up so they're a little flexible, and then wrap them around a tree. And those rails were never usable again. Right? So, now, the Confederates could not stop him, having very few troops in the state. A cavalry force made futile attacks on him, but did little damage. By marching in 4 different columns and changing routes frequently, he disoriented any possibility of being intercepted. Right? And so the Confederates were always in the dark of exactly where is this guy going. Lincoln really didn't know where Sherman was going. And Lincoln was asked, well, where's Sherman? He said, well, I know what hole he went in, but I don't know what one's coming out. So, frantic calls by Confederate leaders for the population to rise up and attack Sherman's army. Move all their food and slaves and fodder out of the way. And what they couldn't move to burn themselves. Deny it to Sherman. Right? Attack him, block the roads. Every Confederate leader was issuing this call to the population of Georgia. And none of the people in Georgia even responded. What did they do? They just fled Sherman's army, or they stayed there and tried to rescue something that Sherman's troops would not take. Right? His forces first converged on Midgeville, about in the middle of Georgia. That's the capital city. And as they approached that city, the entire state government fled the capital. And with the capture of the capital, Sherman's troops entertained themselves by occupying all the seats of the legislature, holding a mock legislative session, declared Georgia seceding from the Confederacy and rejoining the Union. And here's a description of what his army did in Georgia. This is from a biography of Sherman called, the fighting prophet Sherman, said, Sherman's 62,000 men came into the fat fields of Georgia like a glacier that levels the terrain, like the Goths migrating into Italy, like locusts devouring the land. They marched with the remorselessness of winter descending on harvest fields. They saw that it was not for speed that they had been ordered to travel lightly. Instead of the scheduled 15 miles a day, they were making 10, half the rate at which Sherman had trained them to march. They understood that the reduction had been made to enable them to waste the resources of the region through which they walked. The campaign would be a protracted Halloween. Right? And anyway, so the Sherman reached the outskirts of Savannah on December 10th. Remember, he left Atlanta on November 16th. Savannah is surrounded by swamps and flooded rice fields, and it could only be approached by causeways, raised roads above the swamps. Confederate General William Hardee had 10,000 men in Savannah, barricaded, and Sherman began the siege. And he threatened Hardee that if he did not surrender, he would bombard the city. And of course, reaching Savannah, Sherman had linked up with the U.S. Navy and had got heavy guns from the Navy and brought them up to the gates of Savannah, ready to fire these really heavy guns. Right? So the Hardee then thought better of it and abandoned the city on December 20th. The next day, Sherman moved his army in. And here we have Sherman reviewing his troops in Savannah. So on the 24th of December, Sherman sent a telegram to President Lincoln, and the telegram read, I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah with 150 guns and plenty of ammunition, also about 25,000 bales of cotton. Now, attracted to and following Sherman's entire march of 300 miles were thousands and thousands of slaves who just freed themselves as their masters fled Sherman as he came by their plantation. Now, Sherman discouraged the slaves from following his army. He knew he could not feed his army and 20,000, 30,000 slaves too. Right? So he was discouraging them. This got him in a little trouble with the abolitionists. But once he had secured Savannah, he gave orders for the coastal islands off of Georgia and South Carolina too, to be turned over to the ex-slaves, so that each family would be given title to 40 acres, and the army would provide tools and seed and a title to the land, so that they not only were free, but they were also independent. And this was the origin of the famous phrase, 40 acres and a mule. Sherman again summarized both the intent of his march through Georgia and his upcoming march through South Carolina in a letter to General Halleck. He said, we are not only fighting armies, but a hostile people, and must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war, as well as their organized armies. I know that this recent movement of mine through Georgia has had a wonderful effect in this respect. Thousands who had been deceived by their lying papers into the belief that we were being whipped all the time realized the truth and have no appetite for a repetition of the same experience. Sherman estimated that his damage to Georgia was $100 million in 1864 money, about 1.4 billion today. They wrecked 300 miles of railroad, dozens of bridges, hundreds of miles of telegraph lines. It seized 5,000 horses, 4,000 mules, 13,000 heads of cattle, confiscated 9.5 million pounds of corn and 10.5 million pounds of fodder. He knocked the Confederate war efforts to pieces. When Sherman left Atlanta, he had in his supply train 5,000 cattle. When he reached Savannah, he had 10,000 cattle. And it fed his army, for 35 days. So, Sherman's army was here. And here, except my picture this year. So after a month's rest and preparation in Savannah, Sherman headed north once again through South Carolina. Beginning on February 1st, 1865, Sherman and his army did more than make North Carolina howl. Here's what Sherman wrote in a letter to General Grant before leaving for South Carolina. With Savannah in our possession, at some future time, if not now, we can, this is actually before he captured Savannah, we can punish South Carolina as she deserves, and as thousands of people of Georgia hoped we would do. I do sincerely believe that the whole United States, North and South, would rejoice to have this army turned loose on South Carolina to devastate that state in a manner we have done in Georgia, and it would have direct and immediate bearing on your campaign in Virginia. And in another letter to General Halleck from Savannah, he said, "The truth is, the whole army is burning with an insatiable desire to wreak vengeance on South Carolina. I almost tremble at her fate, but feel that she deserves all that seems to be in store for her." In Sherman's memoirs, he put it this way: "Somehow our men had got the idea that South Carolina was the cause of all our troubles. Her people were the first to fire on Fort Sumter, had been in a great hurry to precipitate the country into civil war, and therefore on them should fall the scourge of war in its worst form. Taunting messages had also come to us when in Georgia to the effect that when we should reach South Carolina, we would find a people less passive, who would fight us to the bitter end, daring us to come over. So that I saw and I felt that we would not be able longer to restrain our men as we had done in Georgia." So, here's his march through South and North Carolina. Right? And again, nobody knew where he was going to go. They thought he was going to go to Charleston here, or maybe go back into Georgia, and hit these cities. But his main target was right here, Columbia, right? And this march through South Carolina is really quite something, right? But before we get to actual description of the march, there's one incident, very interesting incident. One day in South Carolina, a Union soldier who had just escaped from a Confederate prisoner of war camp was introduced to Sherman. And he presented the general with a song composed by another prisoner of war, which became one of the most popular songs in the country, not only during the war, but even for decades to come. called Marching Through Georgia. And the Shermans, also Sherman's March to the Sea was also a popular song during these last parts of the Civil War. Now for the next 50 days, marching 400 miles, Sherman's army tore South Carolina, and to a lesser extent North Carolina, to pieces, defeating the Confederate forces thrown at him and wrecking the critical railroads that supplied Lee's army in Virginia. As one Confederate leader put it this way, well, actually, hold on one second. This is what Sherman's army had to march through in South Carolina for about 200 miles. Swamps and swollen rivers. Yet, they did 400 miles in 50 days. Right? And that included taking a 5-day break in a couple cities. Right? So they were making over 10 miles a day, where they had to fell trees and use them, but they corduroy the roads. That is, just put logs there, and then the men and the equipment, the cannon would all be, bump over the wooden logs for 200 miles. Right? So General Johnston, remember Johnston's the one that was opposing Grant on his march to Atlanta, right? And then surrendered to Grant in April, right, in 1865. But General Johnston said, "When I learned that Sherman's army was marching through the salt swamps, making its own corduroy roads at the rate of 12 miles a day and more, and bringing its artillery and wagons with it, I made up my mind that there had been no such army in existence since the days of Julius Caesar." Right? So, Sherman was still on the march, somewhere in North Carolina, when on April 9th, General Lee surrendered to General Grant, having fled Richmond with his disintegrating army. 5 days later, President Lincoln was assassinated. And on the 18th of April, General Johnson surrendered the remaining Confederate armies to General Sherman. Both Sherman and Grant are today hailed as two of the greatest military leaders, commanders in history. Lincoln is rightfully declared America's greatest president. What about Robert E. Lee, General Robert E. Lee? Lee, after fading away in obscurity, was later revived, long after he was dead, by the treasonous fools known as the promoters of the lost cause of the Confederacy, the unrepentant secessionists and advocates of state rights. General Grant summarized the significance of Lee later, after his 8 years of the presidency. He said that Lee was not a great general because he was never dedicated to winning the Confederates' foolish war. He was only dedicated to defending Virginia. And had Virginia never joined the Confederacy, neither would have Lee. Now, I would add that a great general does not just win battles. Lee won battles, right? A great general does not win battles and lose the war. A great general puts winning a battle secondly to winning a war. And that's why Grant and Sherman were great generals and Lee was a failure. Both Grant and Sherman lost battles, but both never lost a campaign. More importantly, a great strategist is not only dedicated to winning the war he happens to be in, but has something larger than the war as his passion, as his mission. That is the idea of the nation's mission itself. And the mission of the United States at the time of the Civil War was to represent for all humanity the idea that self-government and a world without empires was not only possible and sustainable, but was a necessity for all human beings to be able to be human. That was the mostly unstated, except by Lincoln, motivating power of this trio, Lincoln, Grant, and Sherman. A final note, the U.S. government has issued 5 postage stamps honoring General Sherman. The first one was in 1891, which was the year he died. Of note is the one issued in 1937 honoring Grant, Sherman, and General Sheridan. As for Lee, the most recent U.S. postage stamp, with his picture on it, was issued about the same time that stamps depicting Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse were issued. So, there's Sherman. Now here is the Soldier and Sailor's Arch in Brooklyn, New York, dedicated in 1892 to the Defenders of the Union, 1861 through 65. And here is the Defenders Monument in Pasadena, California. The dedication reads, erected by the citizens of Pasadena to perpetuate the memory of the Defenders of the Union, 61 to 65. These monuments bring us back to where we began. This is one nation, not a collection of states. We must return this nation to its mission. To do so, we must join the great march of the BRICS today. There's the BRICS. Okay? So, questions and discussion, or did I overwhelm everybody and go too long?
I had a question. Did the Russians play any role during the Civil War?
Yes, sir.
Well, the Russians, in the middle of the Crimea War, which was Britain versus Russia and some others, in order to protect their fleet from being seized by the British, the Russians sent their fleet to San Francisco from the west coast of Russia, or the east coast of Russia, and to New York Harbor. With the implicit threat that if Britain attacked the Union Army, the Russians would join, with the Union Army and fight the British. Right. So, that's a Jen.
Let me just interject something about that. The Alexander II, who was Tsar of Russia then, is the fellow who freed the serfs in Russia about a year before Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And what happened with the Russian fleet is that they had sealed orders that if Britain or any other European powers dared to recognize the Confederacy, that they were to go to war against their fleet, particularly Britain. And they did issue, send their Black Sea fleet to New York Harbor, and they're specifically from Vladivostok to San Francisco Bay, there were incredible celebrations in both San Francisco and New York Harbor, or in the cities there, for the crew with balls, and you can dig up the articles. Also in San Francisco, a fire broke out soon after the Russian fleet had arrived in the city. It threatened to burn down San Francisco. The San Francisco firefighters could not fight the fire. And so the Russian sailors did, and they stopped it. And several of them died. There are still graves you can find up there. So it's very, very, it's quite something. It's really quite something. Yeah.
Go ahead, Eric.
Concurrently, the British were quite partial to the Confederacy, as we all know. They were really, they had vested interest in the cotton industry, and so to the fact that the Union was fighting to save the Union, they liked the Confederacy because they were ready to go on defend the Confederacy just like the Russians were ready to defend the Union, because they felt that their own interests were threatened that way too. So the war itself almost became a world war. World War A. Maybe that's a good name for it. I don't know.
That's true. But see, the victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, July 3rd and 4th, 1863, prompted Queen Elizabeth, or Queen Victoria, to issue a royal announcement on something like the 29th of July, 3 weeks later, right? Saying that, for once and for all, Britain has made the decision it will not interfere in the American Civil War. Right? So that was the victories of Vicksburg and Gettysburg that prompted that. But the British outfitted Confederate pirate ships that preyed on Union ships, and also which also fought the Union Navy. Right? So, in fact, one of the ships built by the British for the Confederate Navy did not know the war had ended in April of 1865 until about 10 months later, into the next year. And all during those 10 months, it was, grabbing, sinking, and destroying American merchant ships and whaling ships in the Pacific, especially. Right? So, and many years after the end of the war, the British finally paid an indemnity to the United States of something like $20 million for the damage done by the ships that the British had built for the Confederate Navy.
There's a couple of things that, this idea of your conception of what you're fighting for, the mission, you can see how it really does affect, because usually the tendency, like for Sherman was in the South, Lee was in the North. The tendency of a general is to say, I've got to win my battles in my sector. He views it as his region, he's responsible for this region. Sherman, the genius of that, Sherman and Grant, is Sherman was thinking of how do we win the war and aid Grant 300 miles, whatever it was, 500 miles up north. Here's what I can do to help win the entire war. That's what made it one of the greatest flanking maneuvers, because he wasn't thinking about, I'm going to take the land and then I make it, He was saying, what's the strategic importance for the overall battle? And I was thinking about it in, two things. One, in this organization, Lynn has been stressing recently, we've got to make sure we fight as one unified force. On one level, first for the nation, as one unified force for the nation. But Lynn also has laid out this idea that, and Lynn has never thought just of the nation state. He's laid out this idea, what is the mission? We have to change the concept of what the purpose of the nation state is now. and he's saying that we now have we have to look for what the role of the nation state is, each individual nation, of how we act to benefit humanity as a whole, which is the BRICS. But the only way humanity can make it now, back then it was the Union, now humanity, is that if each nation acts in the interest of flanking the British Empire and destroying it in the benefit of unleashing the potential of the human species. You know, and it's the same principle. It's the way you think about what you're doing as an individual within the battle, and what that changed the way you actually act. And Lynn has always thought at that higher level. You know,
Grant and Sherman are not considered the great generals they are because they won this battle or that battle. Right? I mean, in spring of 1864, Grant was very clear. He said, up until now, for 3 years, you know, there has been uncoordinated Union policy. Right? That, you know, this Union Army would do this and that one would do that, and nothing was coordinated. What we're going to do now is we're going to attack on all fronts simultaneously. Therefore, the Confederate armies that could, because they have the interior lines for the North coming down, you know, so there's shorter travel distance for the Confederates, that they could move armies from one place to another much more readily. You know, so wherever the Union attacked, they'd move the forces in, and then the Union attack over here, and then but stop over here, and they move the forces over there. But with Sherman and other generals attacking simultaneously on all fronts, you know, then the Confederates could not move their troops and concentrate them where they were being hit. Right? So, but this is the idea. This is the idea of the BRICS. Yeah. This is the idea, you know, of the unity of the nation itself, as you know, LaRouche said in my opening remarks, as Lincoln emphasized again and again. Right? We are one nation, not a collection of individuals, not a collection of states. Right? We are one nation with a mission, with a purpose, you know, and in fact, only if we live that and ensure it can we have individual rights that mean anything at all anyway. You know, not like the garbage idea of democracy that Victoria Nuland puts forward. You know, or as Helga said in her presentation Tuesday in Washington, D.C., you know, that the promotion of democracy is a fraud. Look at the democracy in the United States. In the November election, 32% of the eligible voters voted. You know, less than 1/3. And as even the Washington Post admitted, all the contested elections were determined by dark money. You know, what the hell is that? That's Wall Street. Right? You don't have a democracy anymore here. You got a dictatorship, and if you submit to it, well, then you're just submitting to being a slave, and you should damn well just admit it. You know, instead of parading around saying, we're free, because I could go, you know, pee on the grass and not get arrested or something.
So really today, we're really a collection of individuals and states' rights, and we have to become a nation again.
Yep. All right. Who else had something? Oh, Sean.
Yeah, America is
now, someone's going to have to interpret me. My bad hearing and Sean's accent make it impossible for understanding.
Yeah, America is having the same situation right now, which had during 1846 to 65 era, where Sherman and Grant led the war successfully against the British Empire with the support of the presidents at that time. Now the British Empire is occupying America in a different form, where they are controlling the financial power at the Wall Street. And the present presidents are in support of them. So is there any possibility will arise to apply the 1846 to 65 policies, or how BRICS can remove the British Empire's rule from America?
Chuck, can you get?
Yeah, he's basically saying that you had in the 64, 65, you had a fight for the Union with a president that was, backing it, right? And we defeated the British with the objective to defeat the British Empire.
We have the same situation right now.
Yeah, and we have the same situation today
With the BRICS.
Yes.
with the BRICS.
Not with the BRICS, with the British Empire.
Yeah.
In 1846, we had the same situation we are right now we are having, but we are having a different. At that time, we were.
Well, Shan, the issue is what we do.
Yes. Now, actually,
you gotta get the question first.
Yes.
And so he's saying, how can the BRICS? How can we defeat the? We have a president today who's with the British, yet we have the BRICS, and how can the BRICS defeat the British Empire today? Is in a similar situation. Is that, unless somebody else can do it better.
Well, they're the leader of the BRICS. They're the leaders of the world.
Monetarily. That's how you're going to defeat them.
Hmm?
Monetarily.
You know,
That's the way you're going to defeat them.
well,
You know,
the existing system is collapsing. It's bankrupt. It's not. It can't last. It's disintegrating. There was an article in the LA Times yesterday on a conference and a study that was just released that said that over the next 3 years, what they expect is 70% of all new jobs will be low-wage jobs. 70%. They also said that for the first time in history, the new generation has a less likely, or will have a lower living standard and conditions of life, than the previous generation. Okay? That's the great economic recovery we're in. And that is unsustainable. The system will collapse. That's why the war danger is so great. Because an empire in its dying throes never says, oh, we lost, and we'll hand it over to you. Who won. Right? They won't do that. They, like some of the French, at the time of the French Revolution, said, après nous, la deluge. After us, everything can be flooded and go to hell for all we care. Or like George Bush when he was asked about, well, what will posterity think of you? And he said, I really don't care, I'll be dead. That's the President of the United States when he said that, So, this is their thinking. They really don't give a damn. If they cannot rule the world, they will actually risk destroying it. Right? That's the war danger. And it is becoming very intense now as Carol went through and the webcast went through earlier this evening. Right? It's very intense and very dangerous. We have to bring about a complete revolution in this country, and it starts with getting this country to join the BRICS, which means getting rid of Obama, restoring Glass-Steagall, and unleashing the potential that we have as still a republic that does have a constitution, even though it's violated. Right? Now, where'd it go? Well, you took it. Huh? Oh, there. Okay, yeah. All right, this is the new Silk Road becomes the World Land Bridge, the new EIR report, just hot off the press. Right? And in 1987, we published a 250-page book called The Eurasian Land Bridge. The Chinese government officials have told us more recently that all the projects outlined in that report, 80% of them have been built or are nearing completion. Right? The Chinese used our report from 1997 to build their nation. This begins where the 1987 report left off. And I urge all of you to purchase a copy. This did not come off our copy machine. Here's the 87 report, or 97 report. Right? Yeah, Eurasian Land Bridge. Right? And it's $250. If you want it online, that's $200. Right? But we need the funds in order to continue doing what we're doing.
Especially to get these reports out into policymakers and so forth.
Yeah, I was going to say, where Carol started in terms of discussing the webcast last night, in the fourth section is a picture of when, right after the Civil War, Russia gave Alaska to the United States. And a map was published.
Sold it for $7 million.
$7 million?
Yeah.
It's a pretty good deal, right?
It was called Seward's Folly.
Right. But would you say, just in terms of your analogy that you made, the new Great March by the BRICS, in other words, the land bridge is encircling the ring of iron around the empire to destroy it forever.
Right.
Could you consider that an opening shot, since the idea was what this map shows by Gilpin was the Transcontinental Railroad. He called the map, which is right here, says it's called this American Economic Just and Correct Map of the World, is what Gilpin called it, the governor of Colorado Territory, a cosmopolitan railway across the Bering Straits. In other words, extending the Transcontinental Railroad. Just what we're saying now was in effect, I think. Does that make sense, Pat? So we're enveloped. This process actually started to a certain extent in the terms of the idea was right at that point.
Actually, it started earlier.
It started with John
Yeah.
Quincy Adams.
Before railroads existed.
Right.
That was
They had the
why
idea then.
Astoria,
Yeah.
was created as a port, essentially a port city, at the mouth of the Columbia River. That's why Lewis and Clark went over in 1803 across the newly acquired possession called the Louisiana Purchase. Right? So it was always westward, kind of drive, which the British always tried to stop us. So now also, new pamphlet, 28 pages, why the United States must join the BRICS. Right? And so this is a quick summary, essentially, of that 375-page report. Right? It's not the Cliff Notes version. Right? It is a conceptual version. Right? And that is what you need to know. All right? So we have work to do. We need the funds, and you should give them as much as you can. People should take the petitions and get signatures on them saying the United States should join the BRICS. Some of you may remember Dr. Howard Chang of San Diego State University and gave a speech last September or so in 2013 in Pasadena at our conference on the great projects that he foresee, including, he had among them, the Nicaragua Canal, which begins construction on December 22nd.
My birthday.
Right? And on December 20th, we will have an 8-hour conference in Pasadena starting at 1 o'clock. There are flyers on the back table for that, and you should bring other people to it. All right? Yes, Eric?
Pat, I have a question, and then if there's time, I have a couple quick comments, but let me just ask my question now.
Make it quick, it's 2 o'clock.
I will, I know. Historically, there was one flank battle that did not work, and that was in 1878 or 79, never remember which year exactly, when the British and the Zulus had a 2-day battle at Ruckert Drift. And of course, you know, there was a movie made of that, and the British won. The Zulus had this like horn of the buffalo strategy that usually worked very well for them, but they lost. Can you give us a couple of instances, a couple of examples where the flank approach worked real well, like the Sherman March did?
Yeah, George Washington
Okay.
at crossing the Delaware Christmas night, you know, and smashing the British. Nobody expected him to do that. It was impossible, you know. So he did the impossible, and he also did it on Christmas night when the British were all drunk.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it's not military, though, because once Reagan went with the Strategic Defense Initiative, that blew pretty much everything right out of the water right there, because they had done everything possible to stop it.
And they weren't expecting it, were they?
Well, of course not.
No.
Nobody.
No. Or General MacArthur in World War II. Instead of doing what the Army and the Marines said to do, or what the Marines said to do and the Navy said to do, which was, let's battle the Japanese on every island they're occupying, MacArthur said, that's stupid. You just get people killed. Just surround those islands with a few Navy ships and just let them starve. And we'll go to the next one. Right? You know, nobody expected that. Right? But that's the commander who has the respect for human life. You know, who is willing to take and to sacrifice human life, but will not do it unnecessarily. Okay? Whereas the British, say in World War I, at Gallipoli, you know, just have wave after wave of Australians getting thousands and thousands of them killed right into the Turkish machine gun nests.
And if I can, I'll withhold one of my comments for a later time if I can just make one of them. It's about General Lee. It's very interesting if you compare Grant and Lee. Grant, a great general, but a poor president. Lee, a poor general, but a great person. And he did not tolerate amongst his troops or even fellow officers anybody bad-rapping any of the leadership in the Union, because he overheard one junior officer say something derogatory about Grant, and he heard it, and he said, if I ever hear you again bad-rap anybody amongst them, yes, there are enemies, but you respect your enemies, and if I ever hear you do that again, you'll be demoted.
That did not make him a good person. He was a bad person because he betrayed this country.
He did betray.
He's a traitor. He should have been hung. And the only reason he wasn't is because Lincoln understood, Grant understood, that that would just, you know, make the rest of the soldiers of the Confederacy fight more. You know, the only way to end the war was let them go free
And
without punishment.
not now. At some point we should discuss the Grant presidency. He wasn't as bad a president as people say. He had really unbelievable.
We learned that in high
he did.
school.
He had a Wall Street problem.
It's not true. It's not true.
Ensure that the United States joins with the BRICS. A flank, to put it simply, in politics, in economics, or war, is a creative action that is unexpected by your opponent. It's an action they did not think was possible. They did not think that you would carry out. An action, perhaps, that nobody had ever thought of before. An action that catches the enemy off guard and defeats him. And that's what was required 150 years ago, when the United States was in a great civil war. which, as President Abraham Lincoln said at Gettysburg, it was testing whether this nation can long endure. And as we shall see, it was doing what the Confederate leaders did not expect that in the end brought them to defeat and demonstrated that, yes, the nation can endure. From November 16th to December 22nd, 1864, exactly 150 years ago, right now, one of the most outstanding flanks in all of human warfare was carried out by General William Tecumseh Sherman as he devastated the Confederacy with his march to the sea. His 300-mile march with 62,000 soldiers right through the heart of Georgia, from Atlanta to Savannah. And in the process, he violated every rule and principle that was accepted as how to act in war. And as he did this, Sherman and his partner, General Ulysses S. Grant, were the generals Lincoln had been looking for since the beginning of the Civil War in 1861. He had been frustrated as the Union Army was defeated again and again by the Confederates, or was stalemated, because the Union generals were either incompetent, unimaginative, or merely career-minded. You know, what do I get out of this? You know, and these two generals, Sherman and Grant, lived the idea of our republic. They had no other agenda but to ensure it would be victorious and ensure that it would survive the greatest challenge to its unity ever in its history. To celebrate the idea that the United States is one unified nation, as LaRouche stated, tonight we'll join General Sherman in his march to the sea as we work to ensure the successful march of the BRICS. But first, a couple more lines or moments about the idea of the flank, because it's a word or phrase that is used quite often and usually by people who do not know what they're talking about. LaRouche has discussed the idea of the flank many, many times over the decades, always stressing that it is the power of the creative mind that looks for and finds that which had never before existed. In science or economics, it is the new idea that overthrows all presently accepted doctrines. In warfare, it is simply the action of ripping up all the war manuals from the last war and daring to do all that was forbidden to commanders to do. Too risky. You know, it's never been done before. You know, whatever other excuse. And so we'll have a few pictures here tonight. We'll start with President Abraham Lincoln. Throughout the 1850s, as the United States seemed to stumble toward a civil war, what would become the Civil War, our most creative president ever, Abraham Lincoln, positioned himself and prepared himself for the challenge to preserve the Union in the crisis that was developing. a crucial step Lincoln took in seeking the presidency was his speech early in 1860 at Cooper Union Hall in New York City, which put him on the map, so to speak, made him a contending major candidate for the Republican nomination for president in 1860. And of course, demonstrating once again the central role of New York City in giving direction to the entire nation. Lincoln was elected in November 1860. Yet a month before he took office, on March 4th, 1861, the Confederacy was created, led by South Carolina. All the nations of the South had seceded from the Union and claimed to be what they hoped was a new independent country called the Confederacy. And then, despite all Lincoln's attempts to avoid war, the British-supported Confederacy initiated it on April 12, 1861, by firing its cannons on the federal fort at Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, which had led the Union, or led the states out of the Union. But since our focus tonight is not the Civil War per se, but something a little more narrow, despite all the interesting material that we won't cover, I think in the early 1850s, almost a decade before Lincoln put it before the Congress and it was voted for. And then later, when the Transcontinental Railroad was actually built in the middle of the 1860s and completed 1869, the route that Sherman had laid out from Sacramento to the Sierras was exactly the route Sherman had mapped a decade or more before. And then, where'd it go? So he was based in San Francisco most of this time. And at one point, some of the representatives of the Democratic Party asked him to run for as a candidate for city treasurer. And Sherman said no. And he added, quote, "I am not eligible because I have not graduated from the penitentiary." Okay. So, but seeing no future for himself and his family in the Army, he resigned from the Army in 1853 while he was in California, and he went into banking. And remember, his foster father is a U.S. Senator, and so Sherman had all kinds of, very high-level political connections, so going into banking was fairly easy to do. But the entire banking system crashed in 1857, and that ended that career. So 2 careers down. He next became, he actually went into real estate. That didn't work out. And then finally, he became superintendent of a new military academy in Louisiana. A military academy, like West Point. No, this just began. 20 students. All the sons of planters. And a bunch of real assholes. You have to deal with. So he was not even in the Army when the South seceded. And he generally considered himself a failure in life. Right? The vote for secession, though, as it began in December of 1860 with South Carolina, and then in January with the rest of the southern states, that was a move he knew would destroy the nation, and he would not tolerate it. In a letter to a Southern friend, he wrote, "You people of the South don't know what you're doing. This country will be drenched in blood, and God only knows how it will end. War is a terrible thing. You mistake, too, the people of the North. They are a peaceful people, but an earnest people, and they will fight, too. They're not going to let this country be destroyed without a mighty effort to save it. Besides, where are your men and appliances of war to contend against them? The North can make a steam engine, locomotive, or railway car. Hardly a yard of cloth or a pair of shoes. First, what we'll do is we'll get to know our protagonists. General William Tecumseh Sherman and his partner, General Ulysses S. Grant. At the time of the outbreak of the U.S. Civil War, were probably the two most unlikely personages who would emerge to lead the Union battle. Sherman, born in Ohio in 1820, was one of 11 children of a state Supreme Court judge. But Sherman had to leave his family at the age of 9 when his father died, leaving his mother virtually penniless. And his very appropriate middle name, Tecumseh, was the name of an Indian chief, known for his intelligence and his cunning, and sometimes described as a great warrior. So Sherman grew up in the family of John Ewing, another Ohio Whig, as his father was, like Lincoln. Ewing was not only a prominent politician in Ohio, but soon to become a U.S. Senator, and then in the, which administration was it? I can't remember. But anyway, he served as the Interior Secretary. I think it was in the Hayes, not the Hayes administration, I forget. Anyway, so the Sherman was sent to West Point, and he graduated in 1840. And during the next few years, he was stationed at various army posts around the country, including in Georgia and South Carolina, which later, in his march to the sea, this, of course, would be of invaluable experience. And Sherman had one habit throughout his entire life that also was helpful. Whenever he went from his home to somewhere else, he would always return by a different road in order to learn the geography. And he did it everywhere, all the time, his entire life. Right? Now, during the U.S. war with Mexico in 1850, he was stationed in California, and therefore he was not in the U.S.-Mexican War. And in 1849, President Tyler, that's who Ewing was Secretary of Interior for, Tyler, read to the nation about the discovery of gold verbatim from a report from Army Colonel or Sergeant, whatever he was at the time, Sherman. He also helped to survey the city of Sacramento, and in 1856 was the Major General of the California militia that put down the vigilantes. Sherman also laid out the route of the California section of the Transcontinental Railroad in the name of Pat Ruckert, and we're going to discuss tonight, the title I put on it is General Sherman's March to the Sea the principle of the flank and the new Great March by the BRICS. A week ago, in discussions with his associates, LaRouche said the following. He said, "The United States is not simply a collection of local states. The United States is the name of a union which is indivisible, despite what happened in the period of the Civil War. And it means that the local states are not independent states as such. They are subjects of the United States. Their subject elements are integral to the United States as a whole. The idea that a particular state has its own independent right in terms of the United States is a delusion and implicit treason. There's only one United States. There are no separate states. That was a Confederate idea. We don't like the Confederacy. Now, the preamble of the United States Constitution makes that just emphatically clear. It reads, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." In other words, it is the people of this nation that created the Constitution, not the states. They did it to form a more perfect union. They did it not for today's pleasures, but for the general welfare of all the people of the nation. And they did it not just for themselves, but also for posterity, for the generations not yet born. For the past 40 years, Lyndon LaRouche has campaigned with unrelenting determination for the creation of a new global system based upon the ideas expressed in the Constitution as exemplified in the economic policies of Alexander Hamilton, the American system. LaRouche's campaign, emerging over 40 years ago, was totally unexpected in terms of this financial oligarchy's expectations of some potential opposition to their globalized slavery. And similarly, our recently created Manhattan Project to evoke out of New York City a new movement that will give direction once again to this nation to in fact embrace, and very concretely,